Hey everyone. So for chapter six, there's a lot in this chapter about negotiating a collective bargaining agreement. Again, this is probably of all the chapters we've done from this point, and maybe even for the rest of the semester, this chapter contains so much material that I could probably do a whole class and do one whole exam just on chapter six. There's that much to it. But again, I don't want to stress you out. I don't want to go kind of above that. So I just want to focus on really the main points that I really want you to know for chapter six. First off, if you go to figure 6.1 in the book, it talks about the different stages of negotiating a CBA. So the preparation stage, the bargaining stage, the resolution stage. That figure does a really good job of kind of laying out the overall details of what a negotiation looks like. Again, as you heard me say before, I certainly don't expect you to memorize that because, again, this class isn't about memorization. But I think it's important for you to kind of follow through what that looks like. What goes on in the preparation stage of negotiation. What are we bargaining for? What are we bargaining at? How does that look? And then how do we find resolutions and ultimately close out a negotiation session? So pay attention to the kind of figure 6.1. So the next thing, you hear about, like, well, when you sit down in a negotiation table, what do you have to, what do you bargain over? I mean, literally, there's anything and everything. So, there's, terms, wages, and conditions of employment, all things like that. But really, the mandatory items for bargaining are wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment. Those are the three things I want you to remember: wages, hours, and then terms and conditions of employment. So, how do you get, how does, you get terminated, for example? How do you get promoted? How do you, things along those lines, or what we call terms and conditions of employment. So those are the three main things that we call mandatory items of negotiating. So make sure you keep those in mind. And again, then kind of going back, I talked about figure 6.1, but if you go to table 6.1, which is different than figure, but table 6.1 talks about the bargaining items, and it kind of lays out, what that really looks like. So pay attention to that table because it really does a good job of explaining that. So this chapter talks all about strikes, and how what happens when a union potentially goes out on strike. That's probably the biggest. I'll think when you ask people about what happens when things go bad with unions, first thing people think of is, oh, they strike. And while striking is one of the tools, it's not the only tool that can be used in a negotiation situation. But make sure that you kind of understand basically what strikes are and how that works. And related to strikes, how do companies come up with replacement workers? So if their main full-time employees are out on strike, how can they bring in replacement workers to replace those workers while they're out on strike? How does that work? What are the details of that? So pay attention to that. How does picketing work? So you kind of stereotypically see people standing out holding picket signs, and but there are certain rules that go along with how picketing works, where you can and can't picket, things along those lines. So I don't think your book talks about this, at least in this chapter. It talks about it in a much later chapter. But one thing that I think is very important is what a term called secondary strikes. So a secondary strike is basically you can't picket at another place of business, even though as it relates to your area. So for example, let's say that you work at a factory, and that factory produces widgets. You kind of use a stereotypical term, but and let's say that your company sells those widgets to Walmart. Okay. What a secondary strike prevents is you can't go stand in front of Walmart with a picket sign that says, don't shop at Walmart because they buy my factory's widgets and we're on strike with them. So it's why it's called secondary. It's a different company or secondary organization. Those are generally illegal. So again, it's called a secondary strike. So make sure you kind of remember that term as we go along. And we'll talk about it it's either chapter 9 or 10. We talk about it more in advance, but I wanted to bring that up now. And kind of the reverse of a strike is what we call a lockout, where, instead of workers going out on strike, management is having issues with the workers and they lock them out of the factory or the place of organization, whatever the business is. So make sure you understand the differences between what a lockout is, that's related to management, and strike, which is more related to unions themselves. This chapter talks a lot about mediation and arbitration. Again, we have, I think chapter 10 is just all about arbitration. But there's two different ways of trying to resolve situations when they come up. Again, mediation, where you have a mediator who kind of works with both sides to try to help them come up with, resolutions. It's not binding, so whatever the mediator does, they're just trying to help you. They're not saying that you have to do this or have to do that. They're just trying to help both sides come to an agreement. Whereas in an arbitration, you have a neutral third party called an arbitrator who both sides will present their side. Kind of think of it like a mini court case. Both sides present their arguments, and then the arbitrator makes a binding decision based on the evidence he or she is presented with. So that's kind of the differences between mediation and arbitration. So make sure you pay attention to those. The Chapter 6 talks a lot about, a lot of times where a union security clause, and related to that are closed shop versus open shops or union shops. So that's basically, what kind of employees, do they have to hire? Do you have to, if you're going to come into an organization, do you have to join the union, which would be a closed shop, or an open shop? You can come in and you don't necessarily have to join the union to be a part of it. And that's all related to, when new employees come in or people transfer into a bargaining unit. So as far as, know what a union security clause is and the differences between a closed shop, an open shop, and a union shop. So again, those are really important to know. Well, that's it for Chapter 6. Again, I know there's a lot of information, but again, I just want to make sure you understand the general concepts. Again, you don't have to memorize definitions. You don't have to memorize, charts and graphs. But again, just if you focus on those highlights, that's really what I want you to know for Chapter 6. All right. Thanks, everyone.